Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding out that someone just stole your job. Not because you did anything wrong, not because your company failed, but because a ghost came back from the dead. That's exactly what's happening to Canada right now. The United States just captured Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro, and with that single military operation, they didn't just grab a dictator. They grabbed control of 300 billion barrels of oil. That's 20% of all the oil on planet Earth. And here's the thing nobody's telling you. Every single barrel of that oil is pointed like a loaded gun directly at Canada's economy. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how one country's oil can kill another country's economy without firing a single shot. You're going to see how Canada built its entire energy strategy on a lie. And you're going to learn why millions of Canadians might pay the price for a mistake they never even knew was being made. So stay with me, because what happens next will shock you. Part 1. The Ghost in the Oil Fields. Let me tell you a story about a country everyone thought was dead. For years, Venezuela was the walking corpse of the oil world. Once upon a time, back in 1998, Venezuela was pumping out 3.5 million barrels of oil every single day. They were an energy superpower. Their state oil company, PDVSA, was making money hand over fist. The country should have been rich beyond imagination, but then everything fell apart. Political corruption ate the system from the inside. The government stopped maintaining equipment. Refineries started breaking down. Skilled workers fled the country. By the time the United States slapped heavy sanctions on Venezuela in 2019, the country's oil production had collapsed to barely 1 million barrels per day. Most of that oil was being smuggled out on rusty old tankers, part of what experts call the dark fleet. These were ships that turned off their tracking systems, painted over their names, and snuck Venezuelan oil to whoever would buy it, mostly China. The world looked at Venezuela and wrote it off. Dead. Finished. Game over. Canada looked at Venezuela and saw an opportunity. You see, Venezuela produces something called heavy crude oil. It's thick, it's dirty, and it's incredibly hard to refine. You can't just pump it into any refinery and turn it into gasoline. You need special equipment called coking units. These are giant industrial machines that basically cook the heavy oil at extremely high temperatures to break it down into usable fuel. Here's the kicker. The refineries on the United States Gulf Coast, places in Texas and Louisiana, were specifically designed to process Venezuelan heavy crude. They built their entire infrastructure around oil that looks and acts like Venezuelan merry crude. And guess what? Canadian oil from Alberta, called Western Canadian Select or WCS, is almost identical to Venezuelan oil. Same thick consistency, same sulfur content, same everything. So when Venezuela collapsed and their oil disappeared from the market, Canadian oil slid right into those Gulf Coast refineries like a spare key fitting into a lock. For the past 6 years, Canada has been living off Venezuela's corpse, filling the gap, making money, feeling safe. But here's what nobody in Canada wanted to think about. What happens when the ghost comes back? On a weekend in early 2025, United States President Donald Trump stood in front of cameras at Mar-a-Lago and announced that American forces had captured Nicolas Maduro. Just like that, in one military operation, the game changed completely. Trump didn't just grab Maduro for fun, he grabbed him because Venezuela sits on top of the largest proven oil reserves on planet Earth, 303 billion barrels. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than Russia, more than everyone except maybe a few countries combined. And now, with Maduro in custody, the United States is setting up what they're calling an energy trusteeship. Fancy words that mean one simple thing. The United States is taking control of Venezuela's oil. Trump stood at that podium and said it himself. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken oil infrastructure and start making money for the country. Translation: Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips. The big American oil giants are being invited to rebuild Venezuela's oil fields, and when they do, all that oil, all 300 billion barrels, won't just be sitting underground anymore. It'll be administratively controlled, managed, directed, sent exactly where the United States wants it to go. And here's the part that should terrify Canada. Trump also announced a naval blockade. The United States Navy is now patrolling the waters around Venezuela, cutting off China. Remember, China was buying most of Venezuela's smuggled oil through that dark fleet. Not anymore. Now the United States is redirecting that oil toward American refineries, specifically toward the Gulf Coast, the same Gulf Coast that Canada has been relying on for the past 6 years. Now think about this carefully. For 6 years, Canada thought it was safe. Alberta's oil sands were pumping out 4 million barrels per day, and a big chunk of that was heading south to Texas and Louisiana. Canadian politicians talked about energy security. Canadian oil companies invested billions. Canadian pension funds bought stock in energy companies. The Canadian dollar stayed strong because oil exports were strong. But it was all built on an illusion. Canada didn't have a monopoly on Gulf Coast refineries. Canada just had an empty seat at the table because Venezuela wasn't there, and now Venezuela is coming back. Not as a free country, as an American puppet with American companies pulling the strings. The ghost is back, and it's hungry. So here's the question you need to ask yourself. If the ghost comes back, whose seat does it take? Part 2. Canada's fake monopoly. Let me explain something that nobody in the Canadian oil industry wants to admit out loud. Canada never dominated the American heavy crude market. Canada just rented a seat that Venezuela left empty. This is what I call the monopoly by accident. Go back to the year 2000. At that time, Canada and Venezuela were sending roughly the same amount of oil to the United States. They were competitors, equal players. Then Venezuela started its slow collapse. Production dropped. Sanctions hit. By 2019, Venezuelan oil had basically vanished from American refineries, and Canadian oil filled the void. Between 2019 and 2025, Western Canadian Select became the default choice for Gulf Coast refineries. Not because it was better, not because it was cheaper, but because it was the only option left. Canadian oil companies celebrated. Politicians in Alberta called it a win. Investors poured money into the oil sands. Everyone acted like Canada had earned some kind of permanent position in the American energy system. But they were lying to themselves. Here's the brutal truth. Geography is destiny in the oil business. Venezuela is closer to the Gulf Coast than Canada is. A lot closer. If you're shipping oil from Alberta to Texas, you're looking at a 3,000-mile journey through pipelines. You're paying for every inch of that pipe. You're dealing with bottlenecks. You're losing money on transportation costs before your oil even gets sold. Venezuela? They can load oil onto a tanker and have it in Texas in days. They're practically offshore neighbors. And here's the part that really hurts. Those Gulf Coast refineries were never designed for Canadian oil. They were designed for Venezuelan oil. The coking units, the desulfurization equipment, the entire refining process was engineered specifically to handle Venezuelan merry crude. Canadian WCS is similar enough that it works. But it's not perfect. It's like wearing shoes that are half a size too small. They fit, but they're not comfortable. When Venezuelan oil comes back, those refineries won't just prefer it. They'll be optimized for it. Canadian oil will go from being essential to being optional. And in commodity markets, optional is a death sentence. Let me explain why. In commodities, the difference between essential and optional is everything. When you're essential, you have leverage. You can negotiate prices. You can demand terms. When you're optional, you're disposable. Buyers can walk away. They can demand discounts. They can threaten to switch suppliers. And that's exactly what's about to happen to Canada. Right now, Gulf Coast refiners need Canadian oil because there's nothing else available in large quantities. But the moment Venezuelan production starts ramping up, that need evaporates. Suddenly refiners have choices, and when buyers have choices, sellers lose power. Canadian oil companies will have to start competing on price. They'll have to offer discounts just to keep their contracts. They'll have to eat transportation costs that Venezuelan oil doesn't have to pay. They'll be squeezed from every direction. And here's the thing, investors know this. They're not stupid. They can see what's coming. That's why, on the Monday after Trump announced the Maduro capture, Canadian oil stocks got massacred. Cenovus Energy dropped 5%. Canadian Natural Resources dropped 5%. Suncor fell 1.4%. Enbridge and South Bow, the pipeline companies, dropped 3% each. The entire TSX Energy subindex fell more than 3% in a single day. Why? Because investors were pricing in the future. They were looking at Venezuela's return and thinking, Canadian oil is about to become optional, and optional means cheaper, and cheaper means less profit, and less profit means sell. Some analysts said the market overreacted. They said Venezuelan oil won't come back that fast. They said it'll take years to rebuild the infrastructure. Maybe. But the damage is already done, because in markets, perception is reality. Once investors start believing that Canadian oil is structurally disadvantaged, the money starts flowing out. And once the money flows out, the whole system starts to crack. So here's what you need to understand. Canada's so-called monopoly on Gulf Coast heavy crude was never real. It was a temporary accident created by Venezuela's collapse, and now that accident is being reversed. Venezuelan oil doesn't have to win. It just has to show up, and showing up is enough to destroy Canada's pricing power. Which brings us to the next question. If your only major customer suddenly has choices, what are you actually worth? Part 3. The differential death spiral. Okay, now we need to talk about something called the differential. And I'm going to explain this in the simplest way possible, because this is where Canada's economy starts to bleed. In the oil world, there's a price called West Texas Intermediate, or WTI. Think of WTI as the benchmark. It's the price that light sweet crude oil sells for in the United States. When people talk about the price of oil, they're usually talking about WTI. Now, Canadian heavy crude, WCS, doesn't sell for the same price as WTI. It sells for less, sometimes a lot less. The difference between the two prices is called the differential. For example, let's say WTI is trading at $70 per barrel. WCS might be trading at $55 per barrel. That means the differential is $15. Canadian producers are getting $15 less per barrel than the benchmark price. Why? Because heavy crude is harder to refine. Because it costs money to transport it. Because buyers demand a discount for dealing with a lower quality product. The differential is normal, it's always there. But here's the problem. When the differential gets too wide, it destroys profitability. And right now, the fear of Venezuelan oil returning is making that differential wider. Let me walk you through what's happening. Before the Maduro capture, the WCS-WTI differential was already around $15 to $20 per barrel. That's painful, but manageable. Canadian producers could still make money, but now, with Venezuela coming back into play, the market is panicking. Investors are thinking, if Venezuelan heavy crude floods the Gulf Coast, Canadian oil will have to compete, and to compete it'll have to get cheaper. So what happens? The differential starts widening before Venezuelan oil even shows up. Traders start pricing in future competition. Buyers start demanding bigger discounts. Pipeline companies start worrying about space allocation, so they favour whoever pays more for shipping. Canadian producers get squeezed. Let's run through some scenarios. Scenario 1, Venezuela ramps up production from 1 million barrels per day to 2 million barrels per day. That's an extra 1 million barrels of heavy crude hitting the market. Gulf Coast refiners suddenly have more options. They start playing Canadian suppliers against Venezuelan suppliers. The differential widens to $25 or $30 per barrel. Canadian producers see their profit margins shrink by 30 to 40%. Scenario 2, Venezuela hits 3 million barrels per day within 5 to 10 years. Now we're talking about serious competition. The differential could widen to $35 or $40 per barrel. At that point, some Canadian oil sands projects become unprofitable. Companies start shutting down production. Layoffs begin. Investment stops. Scenario 3, the nightmare scenario. The United States fully integrates Venezuelan oil into its energy system and actively favours it over Canadian oil for strategic reasons. The differential blows out to $50 or more. Canadian heavy crude becomes almost worthless. The entire oil sands industry faces existential collapse. Now, you might think I'm exaggerating. But look at what happened on that Monday in January 2025. Canadian oil stocks didn't just dip, they crashed. Cenovus and Canadian Natural Resources, two of the biggest oil sands producers in the country, dropped 5% in one trading session. That's billions of dollars in market value wiped out in hours. Why? Because investors were running the same scenarios I just described. They were looking at the risk and thinking, this could get ugly fast. And here's the really scary part. This isn't just about oil companies losing money. This is about the structural foundation of Canada's economy cracking. Let me explain. Canada's federal and provincial governments rely heavily on oil revenues. Royalties, taxes, corporate income, all of it flows from oil production. When oil prices drop, or when the differential widens, those revenues collapse. Provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan and Newfoundland are especially exposed. Alberta alone gets a huge chunk of its budget from oil royalties. When those royalties shrink, the government has to cut spending. That means less money for hospitals, schools, roads, public services. Then there's the currency. The Canadian dollar is what economists call a petrocurrency. It's tied to commodity prices, especially oil. When Canadian oil loses value, the Canadian dollar weakens. And when the dollar weakens, everything imported into Canada gets more expensive. Groceries, electronics, medicine, all of it. Then there's the pension funds. Millions of Canadians have their retirement savings invested in oil stocks. When those stocks crash, retirement accounts shrink. People who thought they were secure suddenly aren't. And finally, there's capital flight. When investors lose confidence in Canadian oil, they pull their money out and invest it somewhere else. The United States, Norway, the Middle East, anywhere that looks more stable. That capital flight weakens Canada's entire financial system. So this isn't a price cycle. This isn't a temporary dip. This is a structural threat to Canada's economic model. The differential death spiral isn't just a catchy phrase. It's a real phenomenon where fear feeds on itself. Prices drop, which causes more fear, which causes more selling, which causes prices to drop even more. And it all started because a ghost came back from the dead. Transition. When your economy depends on a product that someone else can now sell cheaper, what happens next? Part 4, the US. Monopsony trap. Now let's talk about something most people don't understand. Canada doesn't sell oil to the world. Canada sells oil to one customer, and that customer just took control of Canada's biggest competitor. There's a word for this situation: monopsony. Most people know what a monopoly is. That's when one seller controls the market. A monopsony is the opposite, is when one buyer controls the market, and that's exactly what Canada faces. Roughly 97% of Canadian oil exports go to the United States. 97%. That means Canada has almost no negotiating power. The United States can set the terms, dictate the prices, and change the rules whenever it wants. And now, with the United States taking control of Venezuela's oil through this energy trusteeship, the situation gets even worse. Here's why. The Gulf Coast is where the battle happens. It's the biggest refining complex in the world. It's where Canadian heavy crude competes for space, and now it's where Venezuelan heavy crude is coming back. Think of the Gulf Coast like a watering hole in the desert. There are two dinosaurs trying to drink from it, Canada and Venezuela. But the United States owns the watering hole, and the United States just adopted Venezuela as its pet. Who do you think gets priority? Canada has been scrambling to diversify. The Trans Mountain Expansion, or TMX, is a pipeline project designed to move Canadian oil to the west coast so it can be shipped to Asia. Politicians in Ottawa and Alberta have been pushing this project hard, talking about how it'll open up new markets and reduce dependence on the United States. Great idea. Except for one problem: building pipelines takes time. A lot of time. TMX has been in development for over a decade and it's still not fully operational. Meanwhile, geopolitical realignment happens fast. The United States captured Maduro in one weekend. The energy trusteeship was announced days later. American oil companies were invited to rebuild Venezuela within a week. Canada is trying to build a lifeboat while the ship is already sinking. And even if TMX gets built, even if Canadian oil starts flowing to Asia, it doesn't solve the core problem. Canada is still a landlocked giant drinking through a 3,000-mile straw. Venezuela, on the other hand, is offshore next door. They can load oil onto tankers and ship it to the Gulf Coast in days. They're faster, cheaper, and better positioned. And here's the political reality that nobody wants to say out loud. The United States does not care about Canada's economic survival. American self-interest will always come first. If the United States can secure cheap, reliable oil from Venezuela under its own control, it will do that. Canadian jobs, Canadian pensions, Canadian government revenues, none of that matters to Washington. Canada has spent decades building its economy around the assumption that the United States is a reliable partner. But the Maduro capture just proved that assumption wrong. The energy trusteeship isn't a partnership, it's a takeover. The United States isn't helping Venezuela rebuild out of kindness. It's taking control of the largest oil reserves on Earth to serve its own interests. And if that means squeezing Canada out of the Gulf Coast market, so be it. Think about it this way. The United States now controls two sources of heavy crude: domestic production, which is growing, and Venezuelan production, which is about to be rebuilt under American supervision. Why would the United States need Canadian oil? The answer is, it doesn't. Not really. Canadian oil is convenient. but it's not necessary. And the moment Venezuelan oil starts flowing again, Canadian oil becomes a backup option at best. That's the monopsony trap. When you only have one buyer, that buyer owns you. And when that buyer decides you're not essential anymore, you're finished. Canada is realizing this too late. The warnings were always there. Energy experts, economists, political analysts, they've been saying for years that Canada needs to diversify its export markets. But nobody listened because the money was good. Now the money's about to stop being good, and Canada has no plan B. The United States trusteeship over PDVSA effectively internalizes Venezuelan supply into the American energy system. It's not foreign oil anymore, it's controlled oil, and controlled oil is more valuable than imported oil. Canada is on the outside looking in. The United States secured its lifeline, and in doing so, it tightened the noose around Canada's neck. Part 5. The human cost of cheap oil. Let's stop talking about numbers for a second and talk about people. Because when commodity prices collapse, real human beings pay the price. Alberta is Canada's oil heartland. It's where the oil sands are. It's where the jobs are. It's where entire towns exist because of energy production. And when oil prices drop, or when the differential widens, or when Venezuelan competition crushes Canadian producers, those towns suffer. First come the layoffs, oil rigs shut down, contractors lose their jobs, trucking companies see their routes cut. Service companies that supply equipment and maintenance start bleeding workers. The ripple effect spreads fast. Then come the government cuts. When oil royalties collapse, provincial governments lose revenue. Alberta's budget gets slashed. That means less money for hospitals, schools, infrastructure. Nurses get laid off, teachers lose jobs, road repairs get delayed, then the housing markets collapse. In oil-dependent towns like Fort McMurray, home values are tied to the energy industry. When the industry shrinks, people leave. Demand for housing drops. Prices crash. Homeowners who bought at the peak suddenly find themselves underwater on their mortgages. Foreclosures spike. Retirement funds take a hit. Millions of Canadians have their pensions invested in energy stocks. When Cenovus, Canadian Natural Resources, and Suncor drop 5% in one day, retirement accounts shrink. People who are planning to retire at 65 suddenly have to work until 70. Then there's the psychological toll. Oil workers are proud people. They built an industry. They powered the country. And now they're being told that their work doesn't matter because someone else can do it cheaper. The resentment builds. Alberta starts blaming the federal government for not protecting the industry. Ottawa starts blaming Alberta for being too dependent on oil. National unity tensions rise. Western alienation, the idea that Western Canada is ignored and exploited by Central Canada, gets worse. Indigenous communities suffer too. Many First Nations in Alberta and Saskatchewan have partnerships with energy companies, royalty agreements, job programs, community investments. When the energy industry collapses, those partnerships disappear. Revenue streams dry up. Communities that were starting to build economic stability get knocked back down. And here's the cruel irony. Venezuela's political collapse once destabilized families, destroyed communities, and forced millions of people to flee the country. Now, because of Venezuela's forced revival under American control, Canadian families might face their own economic shock. This isn't about charts and graphs. This isn't about market theory. This is about real people losing real jobs, real homes, real futures. When nations fight over sludge, civilians pay the price. And the worst part? Most Canadians don't even see it coming. The politicians aren't talking about it honestly. The media is focused on other stories. The average person in Toronto or Vancouver has no idea that Venezuela's oil could destroy the economy of an entire province. But it's happening, right now, and what happens next depends on how Canada reacts, or refuses to. Part 6. The audit verdict. Let me bring this all together. The danger isn't Venezuela. The danger is that Canada built its entire energy economy on dependency. Dependency on one buyer. Dependency on one market. Dependency on the assumption that Venezuela would stay dead. The United States just shattered that assumption. The energy trusteeship accelerates supply competition permanently. This isn't a temporary shift. Venezuelan oil is coming back under American control, and it's going to compete directly with Canadian oil for Gulf Coast market share. Canada's monopoly was always an illusion. It was created by sanctions and decay, not by competitive advantage. And now that illusion is collapsing. The structural risks are enormous. Currency exposure, tax base erosion, investment withdrawal, job losses, pension fund damage, national unity strain. Canada has a narrow policy window to respond. Diversification isn't optional anymore, it's essential. The Trans Mountain expansion needs to be completed. New export markets in Asia need to be developed. Cost discipline needs to be enforced across the oil sands industry. But even if Canada does everything right, it won't erase the fundamental problem. Geography is destiny. Venezuela is closer to the Gulf Coast. Venezuelan oil is cheaper to transport, and Venezuelan oil is now controlled by the United States. The final metaphor is simple. The United States secured its lifeline, and in doing so, it tightened Canada's noose. The title of this video promised to show you how Venezuela's oil can destroy Canada's economy. The truth is, Canada built the trap first. Canada chose dependency. Canada ignored diversification. Canada assumed the status quo would last forever. Venezuela's return isn't the cause, it's the trigger. And now Canada has to live with the consequences of choices made years ago. Choices that put millions of people at risk for an economic shock they never saw coming. That's the economic truth.